Hello, everybody. We're gonna start now. Apologize for the delay with the rain and all. We were waiting to see if everyone could get here, and one of our panelists, Myra, is a little delayed as well. Oh, here she is. Fantastic. Great. So then we can begin. Good afternoon. I am Chris Molatoris, and I work here at the Center for Global Development on our policy outreach team. I want to thank you all for coming, especially our honoree, Geeta Rao Gupta, and her family, members of our selection committee, as well as our distinguished panelists, which actually include three presidents from the International Center for Research on Women. That's Geeta, Geeta's predecessor, Myra Buvnich, and Susan Kombu, Sarah Kombu, who's the current president, as well as Susan Levine, a board member at one time of both the Center for Global Development and ICRW. You'll be hearing from them later on in the program, so thank you all for coming. This occasion marks the 9th year that the Center for Global Development and Foreign Policy honor an individual or organization with the Commitment to Development Ideas in Action Award. To tell you more about the purpose of the award and our past winners, I would like to introduce you to Susan Glasser. Susan is Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy, the magazine of global politics, economics, and ideas. A longtime foreign correspondent and editor for the Washington Post, Susan joined Foreign Policy in 2008 and has been spearheading the magazine's ambitious expansion in print and online at foreignpolicy.com. During her tenure, the magazine has won numerous awards for its innovative coverage, including 2 National Magazine Awards, and was recently selected as a finalist for Magazine of the Year by the American Society of Magazine Editors. Please join me in welcoming Susan Glasser. Susan.
I promise I didn't pay him for that introduction. Well, I will not go on at great length about the past winners because we're here to celebrate today's winners. But I appreciate the chance not only to be here and to congratulate Geeta in person, but also to give you a little bit of history and context of what I think is a really wonderful collaboration between the Center for Global Development and Foreign Policy, which has a rich tradition of picking some incredibly meaningful past winners of this award, and I'm sure that this year's is I think a terrific addition to this list, which this collaboration started almost with the birth of the center, as Nancy was recalling to me. In 2003 was the first winner of the Commitment to Development Award, and some of the past winners are just absolutely some of the most sort of meaningful and interesting figures in this field that you could imagine. Last year we selected a group, and that was my first year of involvement with this. We selected a group called Publish What You Pay, which is a global civil society coalition which is dedicated to promoting revenue transparency in the oil, gas, and mining industries, and I think is a terrific example of selecting a group that perhaps not everybody here might have been familiar with, but really showed what kind of innovative work you can do at the intersections of a lot of different both global public policy, but also the internet and using new technologies in new ways. They're engaged with legislation. It was a really stimulating choice, I think, for this award, and it showed the kind of range of things and of interest that the center has dedicated itself to. Previous winners include everyone from the One campaign and Global Witness to going back to the very first recipient, which was the Epstein Group in 2003. I'm delighted now to turn this over to Nancy, who really needs no introduction, but I have to put in a plug probably because she's too modest to do so as well, and to say that we have also selected Nancy as one of Foreign Policy's top global thinkers of the year, and we are pleased to recognize her.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this bad afternoon. It's certainly worth it to see all of you here. As Susan said, the Commitment to Development Award is about finding a person or an individual who has changed attitudes or practices of the rich toward the poor. And in that sense, it is part of encapsulating the mission of the Center for Global Development. We also have this ambition of trying to pick people and institutions through which we can reinforce the messages that they're bringing to the rest of the world. So it's our effort to have partners in a very real sense through this award. So it's really been a wonderful tradition. I do want to say, following Susan, that we're disappointed that this year Moises Naim, with whom we started this project so many years ago, and who was, of course, the editor of Foreign Policy before Susan Glasser, couldn't come because he's traveling, I believe. But I had to say to my colleagues, you saw some of us huddling before that we started officially, that there's something kind of okay about Moises not being here for what looks a little bit like the Old Girls Club award, except that Susan is not amongst, or some of the others here are not so old. So I have actually the pleasure of saying something about Gita, whom many of you know, obviously, as I look out at the audience here. But I still want to go on and talk about Gita a little bit. As you know, Gita is now the Deputy Executive Director for Programs at UNICEF, and she was a Senior Fellow at the Gates Foundation in 2010 and 2011. Equally and more important, she was the President of the International Center for Research on Women for 15 years. If you don't all know, ICRW is a research and action think and do tanks. In many respects, I learned from ICRW something of how to be a think and do tank, which is what the Center for Global Development is. ICRW is dedicated to improving the lives of women in developing countries. I want to just say a word about, that isn't in Gita's official bio, about a couple of things that to me represent her singular contributions, singular substantive contributions, beyond her leadership and her passion for the issue that came through in all those years at the ICRW. On her own substantive and analytic work, I want to mention two things. One is, Gita was an early proponent of doing research and thinking about its implications on the issue of women's vulnerability to AIDS. We had in the press release announcing this award that, among other things that I remember as being important, this was before this center started, Gita gave the plenary speech at the 2000 International AIDS Conference in Durban, South Africa, that actually put gender at the international level at the heart of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Even earlier, I would say, Gita was one of the people, the way I've always thought of it, who basically was making the point in different ways that women's low status in some settings, in some parts of the developing world, in the context of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, needed to be thought of as a public health disaster. And I think her own work and ICRW's work in that area was very important. The second substantive area that I will always remember Gita for is that she was an early contributor to we must focus on women's economic contribution and on opening up women's society's ability to exploit, in the good sense, the contribution that women are making. The concept of women as agents of change and not primarily or only victims of the situations in which they live. So with that, I want to ask Susan to come back up, and I think Gita comes back up, Chris, now. We actually give Gita the award, and then we take a picture, and then we move on to the panel. So, Gita.
I'll get it for you.
Let's take it out. from CGD and Foreign Policy.
Thank you.
Yes, you all clap. We'll give you the box afterwards. So now I think we call the panel.
Me.
Oh, you talk.
My remarks. I need the podium, Nancy. Thank you so very much, Nancy and Susan. This is an incredible honor to be a recipient of this award from Foreign Policy and from CGD. It is sad that Moises couldn't be here. I was looking forward to giving him a big, tight hug. It's really fortunate that one of my greatest champions, my father, is here with us this evening, and that and unfortunate that my other two champions, my daughter and my husband, couldn't be here in person but are with us in spirit. And I know that my late mother is out there somewhere looking on and feeling very happy for me, not acknowledging ever that it is her efforts that are being recognized. She shaped me. And I know that I would not be the recipient of this award if it were not for two very important ingredients. First, the work and commitment to women in development of the previous president of ICRW, Myra Buvinic, and the risk that she took in appointing me president of ICRW. So thank you, Myra. And the second, the dedication and hard work, often for very little reward, of the staff that I had the privilege to lead for more than a decade at ICRW, and the board of directors who so ably guided and supported our efforts. So I want to say, without glasses in hand, that I raise a toast to Myra and the staff and board of ICRW, past and present. It was our combined efforts, together with the leadership of our many global partners, that helped shape the world that we are in today. A world in which key policy actors and decision makers recognize girls and women, particularly those in poverty, as contributors to and rightful beneficiaries of development, and a world that acknowledges investments in girls' and women's rights, education, economic opportunities, and health as fundamental to stronger, more equitable, and more sustainable economic growth. So cheers to all of you, to all of us. Another factor that deserves recognition today is India, the country of my birth, whose education and economic opportunities benefited me greatly and that I took shameless advantage of. As I often say, growing up as a woman in India, one cannot be anything but angry at the inequities and indignities that characterize the lives of women, especially those who live in poverty, who despite their labor and their contributions to society are forgotten in the development equation. But India is also home to one of the strongest national women's movements, comprised of articulate women researchers and activists who made the case for women's empowerment with passion and rigor as I was growing up there. They made me see that data combined with passionate advocacy was the only way forward. That is what led me to become what I now describe as an activist in researcher's clothing for the cause of women's equality. When circumstances brought me to the US, all roads led to ICRW. It was the only organization in town that did the work that I wanted to make my career. In fact, it seemed almost fated that I would work in ICRW. When I was teaching in India, the only available book that dealt with issues that my colleagues and I wanted to teach in our Women's Studies course at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Bombay was the book by Myra Buvinic, Women and Third World Poverty. It was the book that I taught from, little knowing that one day I would be working with and directly learning from Myra. My mother taught me that it is absolutely okay to brag in front of one's family, because otherwise you may be tempted to do so externally, and that is not acceptable. Since I'm in the company of ICRW's development family tonight, I'm going to take this opportunity to celebrate a few of the impressive results that ICRW and its staff have achieved over the years. the early work on women farmers and their lack of access to key resources, work that ICIW is using today to inform the renewed interest in smallholder farmers. A groundbreaking paper that Myra wrote on how well-intended microenterprise programs for women failed because they were designed based on gender stereotypes, teaching women how to weave baskets and sew and embroider rather than produce goods that met market demand and generated a real income. Pioneering research on the high prevalence of women-headed households and the disadvantages that they face because policies are based on a fictitious norm of a male-headed household. The research program that Nancy talked about that I had the privilege to lead on the vulnerability of women to sexually transmitted HIV because of their socioeconomic status, but leading from that then pioneering work on AIDS-related stigma. Evidence on the prevalence and costs of violence against women in India, which is recognized now as an epidemic and a public health problem. The Millennium Development Project that I worked on with Karen Groen on gender equality and with Nancy and with Amina Ibrahim that convinced the UN General Assembly that goal number 3 had to be more than just about education targets and women in non-agricultural labor. And more than 2 decades of work on adolescence and the resulting advocacy on the consequences of child marriage and what to do about it. I could go on, but I must stop because that much bragging is too much even for family. ICIW's greatest impact, though, came from a stealth strategy that has remained a secret until today. The strategic placement of board members and staff in key positions in mainstream development organizations. So I'm going to mention a few. Karen Groen, formerly ICIW senior economist, now in USAID. Myra, previous president of ICIW, formerly at the IDB and now in the World Bank. There is a reason, after all, that the bank produced a WDR on gender. Nancy Birdsall, ex-chair of ICIW's board while at the IDB and now at CGD. Susan Levine, also a former chair of ICIW board, now a board member of CGD. So we've got CGD covered. Julie Katzman, who I thought would join us today, a member of our board, of ICIW's board now, but also at the IDB, and Moises Naim, who was board member of ICIW's while at the Foreign Policy magazine. And please don't let UNICEF know that I have a hidden agenda. As we look ahead, ICIW, under the leadership of my successor, Sarah Kombu, and the broader gender and development community, needs to be vigilant about 2 consequences of our combined success. And I thought, just to set the panel discussion going, I'd share the 2. First, efforts to economically empower girls and women have contributed to a huge surge of investment in women's entrepreneurship. While this investment is clearly beneficial, let us not kid ourselves into believing that it is going to help the millions of women who live in desperate poverty. Entrepreneurship programs are about small and medium-sized businesses, and as a result are targeted to women who live above the poverty line. Our goals for gender and development must stay focused on women who live in poverty and the pro-poor policies and social protection programs that will give them a more just return on their labor and an opportunity to survive and thrive as individuals. Admittedly, that is a complex challenge, but it is our job and it remains incomplete. Second, our effort to make the return on investment case, which we made very well, has gained considerable traction. But let us not get too carried away with that approach. There is a human rights rationale for gender equality and the empowerment of women that is much more powerful and universal than the instrumentalist argument. Navi Pillai, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, recently issued a wake-up call to all of us within the UN. Referring to the Arab Spring, she made the point that some of the most dramatic revolutions occurred in countries such as Tunisia, countries that had recently received high marks for progress towards the development goals. She reminded us that our work on development is often too narrowly focused on growth, on markets, and on private investment, with relatively little attention to equality or human rights. As Ms. Pillai said, and I quote, "We did not get the answers wrong, we just never asked many of the most important questions." It is important to remember that, and I quote again, "Participatory development is more sustainable. Accountable development is more efficient, non-discriminatory development is more equitable, and the empowerment of women, minorities, and marginalized communities mobilizes vastly more development resources to the cause. I end the quote. I could not agree more. Yes, they give us economic benefits, but equality and freedom are goals in their own right, goals that are worthy of our collective pursuit. To ignore them is a disservice to our mandate and a betrayal of our commitment to the rights of and well-being of women and children. So with those words of caution, I look forward to panel discussion, and thank you very, very much for this award.
While Geeta sits down, I want to say a few more things. First, I knew she would give a great speech. And let us get it onto our website. I think it looked as though some of it at least is written out. So you can all reread it at your leisure in the next week or more, and we can make sure that many more people hear it. Geeta made fantastic points. Second, I was supposed to make it clear that this is not an inside job, Geeta getting the award. We actually have a committee that, and I forgot. So I'm going to tell you the members of the committee. It is co-chaired by myself and Moises. The other three members are Susan Glasser, Duncan Green, who's the head of research for Oxfam Great Britain, and Isabel Munilla, who was the awardee last year of she represented Publish What You Pay last year when we gave Publish What You Pay the award. What this means is that we will want Geeta to be on the committee that decides on the awardee next year. Now, with that, let me say a few quick words about the members of our panel, things that you haven't already heard, starting with Myra Buvanich, who just retired recently, as Geeta said, as the sector director at the World Bank on Gender and Development, and who really finally brought, in my view, the World Bank up to snuff on these issues, and congratulations, Myra. In particular, the WDR on gender finally came out. I'm sure that Myra was important in making sure that that happened. Myra holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Wisconsin. And before she went to the World Bank, as Geeta mentioned, she was a colleague of mine at the Inter-American Development Bank and really did bring to the IDB important work on the costs of violence to women in Latin America, or the cost to society of violence against women in Latin America. We haven't really properly introduced Susan Glasser, who's going, no, I don't need to do Susan, sorry. Sarah Kombu is the current president of the ICRW. She is a global health specialist. She worked at ICRW in particular on health issues. She spent over a decade living in Sub-Saharan Africa, working for CARE. I think it's very interesting. She established the CARE country office in Cote d'Ivoire at a difficult period of civil conflict in that country, and worked on programs in Rwanda, Sudan, Somaliland. So she knows some of the toughest places in the world, and has a doctorate in international health policy from the Boston University. And Susan Levine, as Geeta mentioned, was chair of the board during Geeta's presidency at ICRW. She has spent most of her career in the private sector, Lehman Brothers. She also has been at the Treasury Department, 2 years at OPIC as Senior Vice President for Policy and Business Development. We've just had another former OPIC person enter the room. She was chair of the board at ICRW, where I have to say, as the prior chair, she shamed me by really bringing transformation to that board in her partnership with Geeta, including bringing much more private sector influence and push to that board, and is now the managing director at Ramus, an investment management arm of the Cohen Group in New York. With that, could the members of the panel join me, please? And we'll take a few minutes to go back and forth up here and then see if some of you have questions, comments, ideas, reactions to Geeta's speech, which I was quite taken with, I must say. So the first thing I want to do is ask Sarah, Geeta, and Myra what you would like to say about your respective tenures. Not so much about what you accomplished, because I think Geeta has given us a terrific summary, at least some major highlights. But what were the problems you encountered in getting these things on the agenda? Maybe we could start with you, Myra.
Sure. Thank you, and it's obviously a great pleasure to be here. And
Have you got your mic?
Sorry.
Yeah.
The first thing that I want to say is that, the first 20 years of ICRW, there was a lot of love of all the few of us that were there, but also a lot of sweat and a few tears and a lot of fun too. But, I really have to thank Geeta, because it would have been a shame that those 20 years would have gone down the drain, and they could have gone, because we left a center that was, it was a very well-run organization, but it was very small. ICRW did not have an endowment. ICRW never had any sort of great connections with politics or whatever, and it was a wonderful job that Geeta did and really took ICRW to the next level. So thank you very much. The other thing, I don't want to say another problem, but I want to recognize, actually, Geeta mentioned this book, Poverty as a Women's Issue, Women's Poverty in the Third World, and I have to tell you that book that actually ended up being very influential and influenced the IDB and the World Bank, and had the major chapter in the book was by somebody called Nancy Birdsall and Bill McGreevy. So, and it was an incredibly influential chapter. So I do really want to thank Nancy for, all the wisdom that she gave ICRW. And I mean, one of the very interesting things of the early work of ICRW is if you go back today and read some of those early work, they are as current today as they were 30 years ago. The main difference is now there's more data. So, the assertions are backed by more robust evidence. But go back and read Nancy's and Bill's chapter, and you'll see exactly what today was at the WDR on Gender Equality and Development was said equally well by Nancy and Bill 30 years ago. Thank you.
Sarah?
Short tenure, a year and a half, and I have the privilege of standing on the shoulders of giants. They're all sitting here in the front, and really the discourse is at such a different place given all the work that's been done. I think what we're dealing with right now is the fact that we've been able to establish the why, and gender's truly on the radar. Now there's the huge demand of the how-to. And so for ICRW, as a research institution, it's really taking the knowledge that we've generated across 35 years and beginning to make that available to those who want to do better on their gender programming. So for us as a team of researchers, it's that current portfolio, which is the strategic advice, the intervention research, the documentation, and continuing to make the case, and then finding the time, and truly that's what it is, finding the time to reflect across all of that work and distill it and begin to project forward and what's the next generation. So that's the current challenge at ICRW. Yes.
Implementation science is coming to development, maybe, finally. Geeta, you've talked about successes. Maybe instead of trying to answer the question, I'll do the challenge, but you could also say, when did you feel, oh, I'm finally getting through to them? Or have you yet felt I'm finally getting through to them?
I think just to talk about the challenge first, because it's linked to the question you asked. It was when I became president critical to get the message out to the unconverted. Up to that point, we had a core group of people who understood the topic, who believed in the issue, but starting from the board onward, trying to bring people into ICRW so that they could understand the work that we do and its importance to development, who hadn't thought of this issue before. So that was, for me, the biggest challenge. And I think the reason why we were able to expand the size and impact of ICRW during those years. In terms of, what was the question you asked?
Was there a moment?
Oh, yeah.
Or a time or a particular issue that you felt really got through to a much broader community, past the insiders, the geeks,
The singular moment for me was that 2000 speech at Durban, because something about that, explaining what gender is and how it affects women and men, because I think I did that, and not just women, there was this sigh. I heard a sigh in the audience when I said it affects both women and men, and started to explain how, and that the HIV epidemic was being spread because of that. And then went back to say, but there's a historical legacy of disadvantage that women experience, and their vulnerability therefore deserves attention. And I think that's what caught on. From then on, people sort of understood it. Up to that point, the word gender has really messed us up, incidentally. During Myra's tenure and a little beyond, we were able to say women and development or women in development, and it was enough, it was sufficient. With gender as being the underlying concept, of course, the socio-cultural sort of construct that affected the way women experienced the realities of their lives. But when it became gender in development, it got all muddied up, and that was a huge challenge to try and explain to people that yes, we're looking at that construct of gender and how it affects women, and we're paying attention to women because they have been disadvantaged for a long time. It took a while to convince people. It went back to, well, shouldn't we be looking at women and men? I remember WHO thinking we should rename the unit of women and community health to be gender and women and family health or something like that. People were very confused for a while. So it took some doing, Nancy, is all I'll say. There wasn't any particular moment. I know there were several. When Goldman Sachs' CEO said women are the engine of growth, and we shouldn't wait for growth to occur, we should spur it. That was a big moment to think that somebody at that level was actually giving credit where credit is due. And I would say, other such moments where there were sort of big committees or big meetings where, I remember being in a meeting where somebody said, gender schmender, what's that about? And at the very next meeting, saying, well, you're right, this is important, and how do we make this happen in our conference? So it's hard work. It took a lot of convincing, and it's difficult, as Sarah and Myra will attest to be the gender police in discussions, constantly reminding people that this is an important construct that you need to pay attention in development.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Myra on this, because Myra's title at the World Bank, I checked, was Gender and Development. But Susan Levine first. Maybe you could say something about, because Geeta just mentioned Goldman Sachs. It's an odd, at the moment, exemplar maybe for engagement on this kind of issue. But since you've spent many years in the private sector, how is this issue seen, and what do you think could or should or has been done? What do you want to say about that? For those of you who don't know, one of the things Susan did, as I mentioned at the ICRW board, was to greatly expand the kinds of people who got interested in, through ICRW, the issue. But
thanks, Nancy. And Geeta, congratulations. And I particularly like what you said at the end of your remarks about it being more about a tool, about, it's investing in women. It's not just about the return on investment, because that's really where I started my learning on this issue when I was at the Treasury Department. And Larry Summers was the Undersecretary, and I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Development, Debt and Environmental Policy. As I tell people, the longer the title, the less the power. But and I remember traveling in Africa and giving a speech about the importance of investing in girls' education and citing Larry's work at the World Bank on that. But also it's the work that ICRW had been doing for years. And so it was Nancy who suggested I consider joining the board of ICRW when I left the government. And when I joined the board, I think there was one person from the private sector on the board. And the rest of the board was comprised of like-minded individuals, people from other think tanks, people from the Hill, people from other nonprofits. And it seemed to me that it was just, it was a good board. I mean, it was very helpful to the president in terms of ideas and issues, but it certainly, to me, was not going to be a mechanism to broaden kind of knowledge about these issues and why they're important. And what I learned and what really resonated with people when I would talk to them is that ICRW is all about research. So anything that comes out of the mouths of people from ICRW is research-based. It's not, anecdotal. And so I, with Geeta, said, let's try to get some different kinds of board members. And we started that. We didn't kick people off, although there were a couple people who didn't come to board meetings, and we would say to them, you're not coming to board meetings. Do you really want to be on the board? And nobody ever does that. I've been on other boards, and we keep trying those techniques. But, and as people went off the board, we started looking for people who, first we had to go court them, because you can't just go to somebody from the private sector and say, hey, here's this great organization, why don't you join? So we started having dinners at my house and other people's. And I remember one of the things that Moises and I said to Geeta is, Geeta, get somebody else to work on the internal. You need to be out there talking. And Durban, I think, is just one example of Geeta out there talking. But when I left the board, because I was term limited off, the board was then comprised of many people from the private sector, including somebody that you all see on television all the time, Mohammed El-Arian. He's now become the board member that everybody is going after, but we got him first. And, Caroline Atkinson, and just, the numbers of people that we brought on with private. And the reason for it was that we felt that if you really wanted to get people to support organizations financially, first of all, they had to be able to look at your list of board members and see, oh, this person is on, and that person is on, and it was really important because we were looking for money, plain and simple. When I joined the board, I think ICRW depended on about 40% of its budget from AID, and we knew that wasn't sustainable. So yes, we had to, step up the work with foundations, but also with the private sector. So, and then I went to the Center for Global Development, and I think that board started because of the experience of ICRW with thinking about, let's have different types of people on this board. And so I guess that's kind of the main thing, because I really do think if you want to get people, Goldman is an example, or any of these, the more that you see people like you devoted to these issues, and the fact that it was so research-based, that people got. And so I continue, to try to figure out ways to get these types of issues, especially in this world, and we see what's going on in Europe and everywhere. So this kind of research-oriented work that is very action-oriented resonated with people from the private sector, and I think, ICRW was a good example of that.
Thank you, Susan. So Myra, what about gender? Did you suffer with that term, or?
I've come
Myra
to...
her PhD is in social psychology. So, and so is Geeta. So they were gender champions, I suppose.
I've come to terms with the concept of gender. I mean, I don't, but you know, but I agree that it leads to some confusion, and on the other hand, it can be the politically very correct term. And when I was at the World Bank, you know, people, if you talked about women, sort of talking about a woman excludes the other half, right? Talking about gender, you know, people feel that they're more included. So I think it's more politically palatable. And at the bank, you know, one of the things that at the board, they really resisted doing things just for women. You know, they like to see that some of the efforts went to, for instance, helping boys in the Caribbean who don't go to school or who drop out of school. I strongly disagree with that. And at the bank, we had a 4-year program that was called Gender Equality as Smart Economics, where the focus of the program was to empower women economically. And we got a lot of flack from the board because the board said, well, what about boys? And my point is not that boys should not be targeted, boys that are dropping out of school, obviously, or boys that have problems of violence. But my point is that that boys drop out of school not because of gender inequality. They drop out of school for a number of other reasons, and I don't think that the gender field, the women field, we have the right tools and the right frameworks to understand why boys drop out. It is not an issue of lack of opportunities because of gender inequality. It may be an issue of lack of opportunities for boys, but it does not reside on a gender inequality base. So what I say basically is we don't have the conceptual frameworks and the methodological tools to work with the problems of men. You know, the whole field has been really focusing on the problems of women. The same with violence. I mean, and in a sense, you know, what happens also, and that's where, for instance, you know, if you are going to be concerned about violence, not only violence against women, but violence for boys, against boys and males, well, you know, gender-based violence, the concept of gender-based violence is very confusing, and I think that the whole field of violence up to very recently had been targeting men. So you don't need extra efforts.
Interesting.
So anyway.
Okay, I'm going to ask Sarah a question, and then I think we'll go and see if some of you have comments and questions, and we'll give everybody a minute at the end, or a little bit more, Gita especially. But I want to ask Sarah, and others of you out there might want to comment, as well as those on the panel, about an issue that remains kind of controversial in many circles, which is, and where will does ICRW plan to do any work on this, which is the idea that there should be quotas in the representation of women in the parliaments and congresses and in other fora where there's a formal arrangement. Some countries have this, some countries don't. Has there been research on this, or are you thinking about it? Is it still controversial, and why? Whatever you want to say about it.
Okay. So I think the consensus is that representation of women in those bodies is a good thing, in that broadening diversity and getting in new opinions leads to more progressive policies from a development conceit. So this is a good thing, and something that we haven't, as ICRW, done a lot of research on. We've looked at it from a slightly different angle. So I'm thinking back December 2010 and Sheryl Sandberg doing the TED Talks, and why are there more women in leadership? And she goes through the statistics, 9 out of 190 women leaders in the world, 13% of parliaments, et cetera, et cetera. And her 3 points are the women who get into that space really need to be at the table, that they need to be able to engage on those issues and speak to those issues and move them forward. And so I'm thinking of the work that ICRW has done in terms of our support to parliamentarians, in sub-Saharan Africa around women's health issues. And using this moment to build understanding around women's health issues, building understanding about roles and responsibilities in government, and how you need to basically help them connect back with their constituency so that they have information to bring forward and use in their roles in government. So this is the way that we've approached that work in the past 10 years.
Okay, Geeta, you want to say something about this?
I just want to
because
say
I was talking about
Quotas.
forced quotas,
Yeah.
right? Not just, and I think Cheryl may have been talking about corporate government. Sheryl Sandberg,
okay.
might have been talking about everything, but including
Yeah.
corporate.
Yeah, I'm going back to work that Karen and I did looking at the impact of quotas. It is, in fact, the single most effective way to get women in leadership positions. And it is important as a trigger to make it have to begin that process. And then, ideally, after a while, it can be dropped. But initially, to get women to get that leg up, you need quotas, and there is plenty of data to show that it works. Politically, here in this country, it's very unpalatable. People don't like to hear that, but if you look at the evidence and the data, it works.
It works in that it leads to
more women participating in decision-making
Making.
bodies of any kind, whether that's parliament or any other kind of, whether it's the number of women who are put forward for election from any political party. There can be a quota for that. There are different ways to do it. And in fact, one of the people associated with ICAW, Irene Tinker, had done some great work on this issue, and she also supports quotas. So we championed it in the Millennium Development Project as something that should be promoted, but got a lot of kickback on.
Maybe it's an issue you'll go back to in terms of new research. Before we go to everyone, I just want to acknowledge at least two board members, former and current board members in the room of ICRW, John Sewell and Carol Dicker Chair, all here to give more shout-outs to Geeta. So let me see if any of you want to raise any, more. We've done some softball questions here and talk, but perhaps Jan. And do introduce yourself, Jan.
Jan Piercy, SBI, Shore Bank International.
Can you wait for the mic because the sound back here?
Jan Piercy, Shore Bank International. I want to go back to something that's been referenced, which occurred when Susan Levine was chairing the board, and that is to broaden the base for financial purposes as well as inclusion in terms of influencing policy. Because at a moment right now in which we find ourselves, when many organizations that are nonprofit are challenged financially, I think it's worth dwelling a little on what you achieved there and perhaps saying another word about it. And one thing I was very, very struck by at the time is Geeta drew out the point that financial independence is very much correlated with intellectual independence, and that when you are dependent on raising funds to pursue an area like the impact, the involvement of women in HIV/AIDS, if you have to wait until it's understood and you can bring the money in to do it, it's almost too late. So that having that unrestricted funding from individuals and others could allow you to go really ahead of where popular opinion had reached. So I wonder if maybe just saying a little bit more about that, particularly how you translate that now into what organizations that are challenged should be doing. Because it was really enlightening to me when you brought that out.
Okay, but not now. We'll go back to that and see if we have other, so we gather as much as. John.
Thanks, thanks, Nancy. And it's a honor to be here. Particularly watching the organization grow. I'm curious. Geeta and I used to have they weren't really arguments, but discussions about the role of women in entrepreneurship. And now I think the conventional wisdom is that growth is terribly important, equitable growth, and that at the same time that a large part of that engine of growth is small and medium enterprises, which seems to be a flavor of the month, and I'm not sure how much beyond that. But has ICRW been able to move to work in that area? Because I've not lost contact, but I don't see everything that the organization produces.
Okay, don't answer that either, but you might say something about UNICEF there on that issue. I'm wishing, yes, go ahead. I want to let me ask a question while we go to the next person with the mic. Arab Spring, what's going to happen? Any thoughts about that from any of you, from the point of view of the risks as to women? No, well, you can use it the last round to address that. I saw some other hand. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, David Lambert, and congratulations. And I was formerly counselor to the U.S. mission in Rome to the UN and work in these areas. I hope I'm wrong about this point, but I'd like your reaction to it. There's a lot of talk recently about the linkages between agriculture and health, and that we really don't know much about those linkages. And yet, my concern is that our institutions remain in their silos, whether it's the U.S. government or the United Nations. Collaboration is against our DNA. We want our own credit, we want our own turf, it's our team. Would you comment on your sense of the effectiveness of collaboration today, and whether it's FAO and WHO or HHS and USDA, whether there's a sense of appreciation about the importance of collaboration in solving these problems for beneficiaries?
That's a good one for Geeta now that she's at the UN.
Thank you.
I've seen the UN in the field all fighting with each other, and UNICEF is always the one that they're fighting against because UNICEF has the most appeal. Okay, I think with that what we'll do, so we have time for a reception and all of you can meet Geeta, is starting with Myra, give each panelist a chance to answer any question she wants and say anything she wants, ending with Geeta, who should have the last word. So, Myra.
Sure, thank you. I just want to first recognize John Sewell and say that at one point when he was president of the Overseas Development Council, he took in ICRW. So we used to share space, and I think, we never merged. We should have. Nowadays, looking retrospectively, but I think that sort of ICRW became more respectable once it was with the Overseas Development Council, and I think it really helped in the growth of ICRW, so thank you. I just want to make just one very small point on the Arab Spring. It worries me tremendously, and it worries me particularly because one of the responses to the Arab Spring is going to be jobs for males. It's the same thing as, in post-conflict countries, whatever the interventions that come about is, let's sort of get concerned about rape and women and give advice to women and give help in terms of violence against women, but we have to get jobs for men. And that, I think, in the context of Arab countries, where you have a highly educated female population, but with very, very little access to the labor market, it's going to be even worse. Thank you.
Very nice. Very good point. Sarah.
I'd like to address the question on collaboration and coordination among sectors, and we'll let Geeta talk about the UN level, talking more about the work that we do on the ground. Right now we're experiencing a lot of outreach in terms of people working in a more integrated multi-sectoral approach, interested in understanding what do we need to do in terms of integrated programs to meet the real needs of people on the ground. This has been particularly useful for us in the ag sector in Uganda, where we've looked at agriculture, nutrition, and HIV services in rural districts of Uganda. And how do you help people come together, learn each other's language, talk about a more integrated conceptual framework moving forward. So that's been very, very encouraging. And to pick up a little bit also on more of that rights initiative, very interested by the kinds of discussions we're having in Shivajinagar in Mumbai, which is one of the largest urban slums, and working with what we're thinking of as citizen-led development and bringing in the various sectors so that we can see how do we work more effectively as partners on the ground, given our vast range of interests in development, but really begin to bring in the community more effectively so that they're driving that process moving forward. So this has been an encouraging experience for us at ICRW.
Thank you, Susan. I'll respond to Jan's comment. I think there's one of the big challenges, and Myra alluded to this, is there's a plethora of organizations that need this kind of unrestricted support. And I think there will have to be some rationalization of some of these organizations. The fact that Myra said it probably would have been a good idea for ICRW and ODC to merge, and then now ODC is no longer. I think these are things that organizations are going to have to seriously think about. The other way, and I think the most effective way to get private sector support, is to build good boards. Because I'm on the board of Swarthmore College, my alma mater. Boards are the main driver of kind of that kind of funding. It's not that you only want rich board members, but it's that board members speak to other people and they're your advocates. And if you do an event, they're the ones that buy tables and all those things. Because to try to sell an organization to somebody who knows nothing about you can only be done if it's from somebody that they respect and believe in. And so anytime I've gone on a board, it's so much of what I have tried to do and think about is how do we get other people on this board who will care, who will make this their philanthropic priority no matter what their capability is, and then who will be an advocate, because especially in times like this, it's harder and harder. And so anyway, that's my thought. I think that's what we did at ICRW. UN collaboration, Arab Spring, whatever you want to say.
Well, I first want to say, John, thank you so much for coming, and Carol, you too. It's a pleasure to see both of you. John was not just a mentor to ICAW, but a personal mentor to me. So to answer John's question first, no, entrepreneurship, I'm not.
Gita, and it was John who suggested that I consider being chair of the board.
On entrepreneurship, John, it's nothing against it. It should be, obviously we need economic growth, and yes, small and medium-sized businesses are engines of growth, but all I'm saying is it's not sufficient in the immediate for poor women. It's not the thing that's going to be the economic opportunity for poor women in the immediate, and I feel like we're forgetting that and putting all our eggs in this basket of entrepreneurship for women. So that was the point that I was trying to make. Secondly, on the Arab Spring, I agree with Myra entirely, but also because what's really ironic is when you look at the photographs in the paper of during those uprisings, and you see those women, hundreds of women out there marching in the streets, and then you look at how the negotiations are occurring and how, and it's horrible. It's like no women are represented at all. So it's classic. In most conflict situations, women are involved. And then when it comes to the peacemaking process and the post-conflict situation, women get left out. So it is an enormous worry, yes, in terms of economic opportunity, but also just, why do we not have more women at the table as they're building these new societies? Otherwise, they're not going to be very new. They're going to be more of the same. And in terms of collaboration, I'll say to you that it's a real eye-opener how bad it can go when you're trying to deliver as one. That's the mantra in the UN. And we're trying to figure it out. I've just finished a long trip to various country offices. And it always works better when the individuals concerned are keen to make it work. It's all about the individuals. You can institutionalize it with names and tags and all of that, and ultimately it only works if you believe as a manager on the ground that you want to make it work and that you're going to figure out the complementarities. And then finally, Jan's issue. I want to tell you that there was soon after I became president, I think it was about maybe 6 months after, that I called the Ford Foundation without knowing very much at all, and said to them, Myra did this for 20 years. I just don't know how I can do it for another 6 months, which is trying to get projects on board as a project comes to an end. And knowing that if I can't get another project on board, those people are no longer employed. We were literally project funded with no money as a cushion at all, no unrestricted revenue. And that particular program officer said, well, the markets are doing pretty well. Let me see what I can do. And that's how we got $1 million from the Ford Foundation, just like that, because I was just frustrated and picked up the phone one afternoon. But the problem was, he said, not going to give it to you just like that. You have to match it dollar for dollar. Can you do that? Having no clue of what fundraising means, we had 5 individual donors that we received money from. I said, sure, no problem at all. And he said, in how many years? And I said, how about 5? And I can tell you the first 500,000 were a breeze, because we went back to foundations who trusted us, believed in Ford Foundation, and so invested in us. The second 500,000 was because of this woman here. I'm telling you, it wouldn't have happened without her. And it was one of several grants that Ford Foundation made that year to several organizations of the same kind. And we were the only ones who met the deadline of the 5 years. So I share that with you, one, to say we need more foundations like the Ford Foundation, who at that time, it's very different now, who recognize that unrestricted support is what gives us the flexibility to truly do our job well and to respond in a timely way to opportunities that can help make a difference. And yet, increasingly, money is becoming more projectized, and as a result, everybody's busy writing proposals. The creativity of people in these nonprofits is getting totally, lost, because everybody's busy about trying to get the next buck. So it's very frustrating, I'll tell you, as president of a nonprofit, and I'm sure Nancy will agree and everybody else will agree, when you are struggling to do the good work and have to constantly produce good ideas, even though that match a donor's interest, even though it may not be the cutting edge idea that you really should be working on. So a big pitch and push for unrestricted support for nonprofits is what I really wish the world would switch to, especially when they're limited resources, not the other way around.
Would you all join me in a big clap for Geeta and our panel? And please join us to meet the awardee. And thank you again to Susan Glasser and Foreign Policy for joining with us in this annual event.